It's the Halloween month, and much like all those spooky zombie costumes you see in October, in the last few years we've seen several games return from the dead. Whether that be remakes such as Crash Bandicoot, Final Fantasy VII, Spyro, or even reboots and sequels like the upcoming System Shock 3, and even a new Time Splitters has been announced. It just seems like a time where a lot of these old games can return and have an impact in the game industry. Because honestly, some of these franchises were just so good when they originally released, they have just remained in our hearts after all these years. With some of these games, a simple new coat of paint is more than enough, while others can change the formula and fit in with much more modern day games. Either way, I think there is plenty of old games that deserves to come back from the dead. So I made a list of 15 games that should return, whether that be remakes, reboots, or flat out sequels. Now, this is an opinion, and narrowing it down to just 15 was very difficult, so if I missed a game that you would like to see return, just let me know in the comments below. Anyways though, let's get right into the video. At number 15 we have Turok, which is one of those games that really surprises me that we haven't seen in a long time. I remember playing Turok as a kid, and this was at a time during the dinosaur craze thanks to Jurassic Park, and I just remember how cool it was to see these dinosaurs in the game, and then you had these hybrid dinosaur human-like beings. It had really cool weapons, and just the atmosphere itself was so cool, and it's something I haven't really seen a lot of games replicate even to this day. Now, the original was released in 1997, but there actually was a reboot of Turok in 2008. However, it didn't really perform all that well, and we haven't seen it since then in its traditional form. I just find that to be such a sad fate considering we don't really get very many good dinosaur games anymore, and I think if a good developer got a hold of this franchise, they could probably really knock it out of the park. In recent years, it seems like PlayStation has kind of went away from JRPG games, but once upon a time they did release one of the more memorable JRPGs on the market, Legend of Dragoon. This was at a time when Final Fantasy was at an all-time high in critical acclaim, and actually Legend of Dragoon is very similar to the old school Final Fantasy games, and because of this it was a little overshadowed by both Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII. With that said, it was such a unique concept and probably one of the best looking games on the original PlayStation. Sure, it could have used a little more polish, but I absolutely think if PlayStation were to ever dip their toes back into the JRPG genre, then there would be no better franchise to do than Legend of Dragoon. It has the potential, so just make it happen, PlayStation. Truth be told, Metal Gear Solid will likely never be the same again, as Hideo Kojima was Metal Gear Solid. However, that doesn't mean that Metal Gear Solid should end, or at least in some capacity. Rather, I think that a remake of Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2 would not only be a fantastic way of continuing the Metal Gear Solid franchise, but I also think it just makes way too much sense not to do this. These are some of the best games ever created, and every gamer deserves to get to try them out, and we really don't have enough big AAA stealth games anymore anyways. I do know the first Metal Gear was remade on GameCube, but I still believe this should be done. Now, I know Naughty Dog has taken a bit of a drastic turn in terms of what games they release, as they went from releasing mascot games with cartoonish characters such as Crash and Jak, to more gritty games such as Uncharted and The Last of Us. But to this day, Jak and Daxter remains as one of the best trilogies of all time. The Jak franchise really had it all. Fun platforming, good collectathon hidden items, an interesting story with well-made characters, Jak being the serious one and Daxter as the wacky buddy, cool and interesting weapons, including both melee abilities such as Dark Jak and guns. So while yes, Naughty Dog has moved on to bigger franchises, if the right developer could take over and give us a Jak 4, I think it could be really successful even today. Conker's Last Fur Day has become one of those cult classics, with a lot of people just never getting to play this amazing game. But for the ones who have played this, knows exactly what I'm talking about. There's nothing quite like the foul-mouthed squirrel Conker. While it is a 3D platformer at heart with collectathon aspects, there's so much more to this game. In reality, it's probably the pinnacle to parody video games as you set forth on your adventure to meet some of the most memorable characters ever made in any video game, each with their own witty and humorous dialogue, though some of the younger audience may not understand some of the humor, with much of the parodies reenacting 90s cinema such as The Matrix and Saving Private Ryan. With that said, I think Conker could still come back to this day with more modern parodies, or Conker could visit several different worlds from the Xbox library, such as Halo or Gears. I just feel Conker deserves a chance at its own full game, once again, that isn't tied to Project Spark, or whatever Young Conker was. Parasite Eve in many ways can be described in one word: bizarre. But with that said, it's also one of the most memorable games from the 90s. See, it's almost like it's a mix of Resident Evil horror with Final Fantasy RPG elements, which were some of the biggest games of this time, and it made for one peculiar but great game. For the time, the cinematics were done very well, if not a little haunting, and even the combat was strange, where it was random encounters with real-time combat that had you running around trying not to get hit by enemy attacks, and then you attack when your meter fills back up. It was just all very strange, but it all worked so well. I'm not really sure if this type of gameplay would be good in modern day times though, but I do think they could bring this game back and put a modern spin on it. I personally think this could make for one stellar remake. The fact that we have yet to see a sequel to Alan Wake is almost criminal. Not only was it a great game, especially in terms of its narrative and atmosphere, but it ended on a huge cliffhanger. And now we've been waiting for 9 long years to hopefully hear about its return. Luckily, Remedy Entertainment did acquire the rights to Alan Wake recently, and it is showing up in their most recent game, Control, but even then, we want a full-on sequel to get a resolution to It's Bigger Than a Lake. I, however, will say that I do think it's very likely that we will get an Alan Wake 2 announcement sooner rather than later. Technically, these games are still being made, but back in the year of 2000, Nintendo released a spiritual successor to Super Mario RPG, Paper Mario. Not only did they do a good job, but I think it's one of the most memorable games from my childhood, with its paper-crafted world and characters and turn-based RPG elements. The entire world was drenched in charm and whimsical humor. The turn-based combat was fun with its own mix of elements, such as timing your jump attack properly, and even the story and its characters were well done, which is kind of surprising coming from a Mario game. I always loved exploring the overworld too, and because the paper-based elements, it would have several puzzles that would take advantage of it, and it was just so good. Since then, we've got one more game that was very similar, the Thousand Year Door for the GameCube, and after that they released several Paper Mario games that changed the entire formula, which baffles me to this day. Not because they were bad games, but rather because they just weren't as good as the original two. In this situation, I think they should take Michael Scott's advice: KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. And we know Nintendo isn't stupid, so just bring back the classic Paper Mario games. Xbox has often been criticized for their lack of big Japanese games, but at one point in time, Xbox really went hard for Japanese games during the Xbox 360 era, and none was better than Lost Odyssey. See, Lost Odyssey was actually created from the father of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and because of this, Lost Odyssey is very similar to the beloved franchise. Really though, I think they could even treat Lost Odyssey much like the Final Fantasy franchise, and make each game its own individual game, with Lost Odyssey 2, 3, 4, and etc. To this day, I consider Lost Odyssey as an all-time great JRPG game, and I think it's more than deserving of getting continued franchise support. Much like Turok, we just don't get enough good dinosaur games, and Dino Crisis was one of the best ever at this. The thing is, a remake of this game just makes way too much sense for it not to happen by this point. We've already seen Capcom remake Resident Evil 2 with a huge amount of success, and Dino Crisis would look fantastic in the same engine as Resident Evil 2. Dino Crisis is pretty much Resident Evil with dinosaurs anyways, and let's be honest, dinosaurs are way cooler than zombies. If Capcom brings back any game, let it be this one. It's been 12 long years since Half-Life 2 Episode 2 released, and since then it's been a long-running joke that Valve can't count to 3. Not only have they not made Half-Life 3, but they also haven't made Portal 3 or even Left 4 Dead 3. They all are just oddly absent, 3 games in which all deserves a return. Half-Life though easily makes the most sense to bring back, and I just don't really understand what happened to Valve here. At one point in time, Half-Life was considered to be among the best FPS games on the market, and even today, it's still one of the all-time greats, and it was also financially very successful, which makes its long hiatus even more strange. By this point, I would think that it's not a matter of if Half-Life 3 comes back, but rather, how much longer do we really need to wait? I guess I'll let you know as another decade rolls by. A lot of JRPG games comes out with a fantasy setting, swords, shields, armor, and all that. But unlike many other JRPG games on the market, Earthbound, or the Mother franchise, stuck with normal everyday kids with normal names and weapons. Instead of using a sword, you just have a baseball bat, and you're in modern day times, and when you look at this, you're probably thinking, what's so special about Earthbound? But in actuality, Earthbound is one of the most unique games ever made with its charming and sweet-natured world. It's a heavily story-driven game and one of the best JRPG games ever made, hands down. The problem is, we haven't seen the Mother franchise in over a decade, and this is just so wrong on so many accounts. See, big publishers often have a tendency of pushing towards big AAA games, and hey, maybe the Mother franchise could come back as a big AAA franchise, but I also think they could create another installment with a very similar art style as the original Earthbound. Even today, I think its art style holds up, and in recent years, we've seen a huge amount of success with a very similar title, Undertale. So, who's to say that Nintendo couldn't do another Mother installment with the same art style? People obviously still like games like this all these years later, and you wouldn't even have to put a huge budget into this. If there's one game on this list that I have supreme confidence in to transform into a more modern franchise, it's Perfect Dark. Perfect Dark originally released on the Nintendo 64 back in 2000 after Rare's massive success with 007 GoldenEye. Because of this, the two are actually very similar in many ways, but Perfect Dark was completely original, giving Rare its own IP. It had you going through several different missions where you could choose how you would complete each case. It was brilliantly done, but after Perfect Dark Zero released for the launch of the Xbox 360, the franchise has just kind of vanished. Though I must say that if Xbox were to ever reboot one franchise, it should be this one. This franchise would fit so perfectly into modern day games. They could either stick with the first-person shooter genre and give it more stealth-based elements, or they could even go in an entirely different direction by going third-person and making it more similar to the Uncharted and Tomb Raider franchise with a mix of Splinter Cell and Metal Gear Solid. I just feel like they could go a number of different ways to bring back Perfect Dark with a success, so let's make it happen. The one franchise that I'm duped into believing it'll return every single year is BanjoKazooie, but eventually I am going to get this one correct. BanjoKazooie goes down as one of the best 3D collectathon platformers ever, and arguably it is the best. It really is that good, and it still holds up today, which brings me to my main point. So far, we've seen a few franchises get remade from the 90s, and recently with both Spyro Reignited and Crash Insane Trilogy having very successful remakes. Banjo 1 and 2 remakes is an absolute no-brainer. Honestly, this is free cash for Xbox, and I'll give you my down payment right now. And we're starting to see the love for Banjo as well with the most recent Smash Ultimate release and how fans went absolutely crazy for it. I'd love a Banjo 3, but for now, I'd be more than okay to just have a Banjo 1 and 2 remake. And the number one game that deserves to make a comeback in a big way is none other than Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger is pretty universally believed to be one of the best JRPG games to ever be made, and many believes it is the absolute best. The game itself is fun, it has an unbelievably good story and characters, and it has Toriyama's well-made art style, and that's the thing. I don't think you can just make another Chrono Trigger and replicate its magic, but rather, I think this should be a remake. I mean, if we can get a Final Fantasy VII remake to make it more like modern day Final Fantasy games, then I see no reason that we can't have a Chrono Trigger remake to make it more like modern Dragon Quest games. There's a reason that people have such fond memories of this game and believe it to be not just the best JRPG, but one of the best games ever made. It's more than just deserving of a big return. Anyways though, that's it for this video, but if I forgot any game that you think deserves a return, whether that be a remake, sequel, or reboot, let me know in the comments below, and if you liked the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and bell notification button. Peace out.